Hi everyone, welcome to our second session in the Burslem Elim Church Leadership course. And the second session here is entitled Jesus the Leader. Now I wonder what you think about when you think about Jesus the Leader. You know, often in Sunday school we get the impression of Jesus being this guy dressed in white, holding a little fluffy lamb or maybe a child. And we don't often think about his leadership style and how he actually led. We look at his teachings, but I love watching the way he did things. And Jesus didn't quite lead in the way that we imagine. He was a lot tougher than we imagine. He spoke his mind. He called people Satan. He called people foxes. He called people thieves and liars. And he really challenged the status quo. He really lived out his message. And he was actually a really, really tough leader. And today we're going to explore his leadership. And before I continue anymore, I want to encourage you, in the notes, there's a link to Jared Cooper's a blog about the real Jesus, and I encourage you to read it afterwards. It's really challenging about looking at how Jesus led and how Jesus did things. But the first thing I see with Jesus' leadership was this: he referred to himself as a shepherd. Now, a few years ago, I was doing some filming for my last church, and the guy who was in charge of the filming decided it would be great to have some sheep in the stable with us. But the first problem was this: we had to catch the sheep. Now, I don't know if you've had to catch sheep. Sheep are terrible. They are stupid. They are thick. They run around everywhere. They do not do what you want. And we spent about 2 hours trying to catch these sheep. It took us ages. And I thought again, what is the point of doing this? But eventually we got them in to the stable. And all they did during my talk was bar, bar, bar. And I was just fed up of them. And you know, when Jesus said he was a shepherd, being a shepherd isn't a job that's great and just dealing with white fluffy sheep. It was actually quite a tough job. I recently looked online for job description for a shepherd, and the things that came out were being self-motivated, having good time management, good decision making, and serving in isolation. It's quite a tough job. It's not the easiest job to do. And Jesus referred to himself as a good shepherd. Now, in the Middle Eastern culture, shepherds were there to look after their sheep. They were there to lead their sheep. They were there to protect their sheep. And Jesus actually says in John 10, when talking about being the good shepherd, he says he is unlike the other shepherds who are temporary. He says a temporary shepherd will come along, and when problems arise, the temporary shepherd will run away. But he says a good shepherd who loves the sheep will be there both in the good times and in the tough times. And this was Jesus' shepherding style. He was there for the long haul. He was there to love his sheep even when they messed up. He was there to walk with the sheep even when they were doing stupid things. And he wasn't there just when the weather was going well. He would have been there looking after the sheep when things were really, really tough. So the first lesson we can learn from Jesus' leadership is this: be a good shepherd. Jesus referred to himself as a good shepherd. And we saw all the way through the Gospels how even when his disciples messed up, he was there for them. He forgave them, he gave them a chance. And he promises even now, as our good shepherd, never to leave us. And he kind of encourages that for us too, that we need to follow his shepherding example in our own leadership. The next thing that we can learn from Jesus' example of leadership is this: Jesus' leadership was powered and fueled by prayer. Now, we can't underestimate this. And in the last session, I spoke about good leaders lead out of their faith. But good leaders, good parents, good pastors, good worship leaders, good businessmen, I believe, will all lead out of their relationship with God. And this is what should fuel them. And prayer is the fuel that fuels our relationship. Now, Jesus, we see over and over again in the New Testament. He didn't try and be everything to everyone. He didn't try and help every single person. You might disagree with me, but show me in the Gospels where he might have. But the thing he did was he spent so much time praying to God the Father. Often they'd be like, where's Jesus gone? Where's Jesus disappeared to? Jesus, where are you? Where are you? And then turn out that he was with his Father. And he spent time praying to God the Father. But I also believe he spent time listening to God the Father too. And being good leaders, our ministry, our leadership, wherever it is, should be fueled by prayer. Now, this is really obvious, but it's important. And I just want to emphasize again, not just talking to God, but listening to God. And as a leader, I've discovered that being able to lead prophetically makes such a difference in my leadership. Being able to see where God wants to take us makes such a difference. And when I'm struggling as a leader, the thing that I do now is I stop, I pray, and I say, God, I can't do this by myself. I can only do it with you. Please help me. And then I listen. And this is what I believe Jesus has called us to do. Jesus has called us and follow his example. And that starts by having our leadership fueled by prayer. The next thing that Jesus learned from Jesus' life is this. Jesus' leadership was defined by his commitment to God the Father, his mission. Now, this is really important. Now, Jesus was prepared to die for those he was leading. Now, we see this in the Garden of Gethsemane when he's in absolute agony, he's sweating drops of blood, and he's finding it really challenging. And he's stressed, and he says this to God the Father. He says, not your will. Sorry, not my will even, but yours. Now, this is a challenge for us. Not my will, God, but yours. And we can learn this from Jesus. You know, Jesus went to death for God's mission. Now, in the past, pastors and leaders and Bible study teachers and worship leaders have actually died for God's mission. You know, I think about Iran at the moment and the church leaders in Iran that are in prison because they sold out for God's mission. You know, God's mission is not a little optional extra for them. It's at the center of their lives and the center of their leadership. And this is what we can learn from Jesus, to put God the Father's mission at the center of our lives, at the center of what drives us forward. And God may not be calling us to die for his mission, but guys, we're called to be committed to his mission. We're called to do what it takes to see his mission and his calling on your life come to fruition. And this is tough. And leadership is not just about the good times, as you mentioned with the shepherding. It's also about leading in the tough times and being committed to following God, even when things get tough, even when we say, God, is there no other way? And I've learned this from Jesus. It's not just about the good times. It's also about the tough times as well. And it's about being committed to God the Father's mission. And that's so important. And this leads us on to our next point. Jesus was tempted by power and money, but he resisted. You know, when you are sold out for God's mission, you want to keep following everything he wants you to do so you can see his mission through. And Jesus was tempted. Now, if you don't think Jesus was tempted, I'd encourage you to read the Gospels again. I'd encourage you to read the New Testament, because it said he was tempted. And Satan tempted him with money and with power. And Jesus resisted. Why did Jesus resist? Because of the previous points. Because he was committed to God's mission. He was committed to seeing his mission through. And guys, we are going to be tempted as Christians. We are going to be tempted as leaders. Often, the more successful we are, the more we will be tempted. And in those times, we have to stick with God's mission. We have to remember what God has called us to. You know what? Good leaders will be tempted, but good leaders will resist. And guys, I've seen so many leaders cause so much damage over the last few years. I've had good friends who've given into temptation, where gold, glitz and glory have stood in the way of them serving God. And now they're no longer in church, in whatever capacity they were serving, because they were tempted by something else. We will be tempted, but we need to remember that we are serving God's mission. And when we remember as leaders that we are serving God's mission, we can focus ourselves so much more on resisting that temptation. And temptation can often come in the most unexpected times. And we need to know why we're doing what we're doing. We need to be committed and sold out for God's mission. The next thing that I learn from Jesus' mission is this. Jesus led with honesty. You know, I shared at the beginning that Jesus wasn't a little white fluffy leader, and he most certainly wasn't. He told his disciples straight when they were doing things wrong. But he also comforted those who needed comfort. and he loved those who needed love. He didn't pretend to be something. He didn't pretend to sneak to parties when no one was looking. He was very honest that he went to parties to meet the people he needed to meet. He spent time with the undesirables. He was honest. He didn't hide it. He didn't try and pretend to be one thing to one person, another thing to another person. He led with honesty. I heard recently an expression about being a hot pastor, honest, open, and transparent. And that's a real key. Jesus was honest, open, and transparent. He told you what he was thinking. He was honest in his leadership. And I feel we need to be honest. We need to be wisdom with our honesty. But we have to be honest as leaders. We can't pretend to be something that we're not. We need to be honest with our whole life. When Peter got things wrong, he said, "Get behind me, Satan." Just to clarify, that may not be a good thing to say to somebody. But Jesus was honest. When Jesus went to the temple, he turned over the stuff they were selling that was dishonest. Why? Because Jesus was honest. He didn't pretend what they were doing was okay. He let people know the truth because he loved them. And then the next point now we're going to go into is this. Jesus trusted those he was leading to step into their calling. Now, being a leader is not about stopping other people from doing stuff. Being a leader is not about doing everything yourself. And I find this a big weakness at times, one of my weaknesses. That sometimes you can just want to do everything because you don't want to inconvenience anybody else. But we're called to equip people. We're called to help people to step into their calling. And that's what a good leader does. And Jesus did this. Jesus spent time with his disciples praying and casting out spirits, healing people, sharing the good news. And then do you know what he did afterwards? He didn't just say to them, "Follow me and just be my little roadies or groupies." He said this. He said, "Now you go out and do it." You know, it's really challenging. He said, "You go out and do it." Now, can you imagine how his disciples felt? They'll be like, "Well, we're not as good as Jesus." Goodness sake, Jesus is God's son. He's the Messiah. But they went out and did it because Jesus equipped them and encouraged them to go out and do it. And I want to encourage you as a leader to help people to step into their calling. This is so important to do. We see in Luke chapter 9 when Jesus encouraged the guys to go out and they came back and they're like, "Wow, Jesus, this was incredible." And Jesus is like, "Yeah, I know. This is why I've been training you. I've been training you so you can go out." And that should be the core of our leadership. If we're Sunday school teachers, we should be looking at training other people. If we are church leaders, we should be looking at training other people. If we're pastors, we should be looking at equipping. If we're in charge of the kitchen, we should be looking at equipping. If we're in the worship team, we should be looking at equipping people and helping them to step into their calling. And that is so important. And there's certain reasons why we stop doing that. Sometimes it's because we worry that people are going to reject us and not want to step into it. Another reason is because we feel let down because we've done it with other people in the past and they haven't come through for us. And the final thing, which I think applies to more people than we ever realize, is we can be a little bit insecure. And being a leader is about putting your insecurity to the side and caring about those you lead more than caring about what people think about you and about your own role. And this leads us nicely on to our final point about Jesus' leadership. Jesus lived for something that would last longer than his time on earth and impact future generations. Guys, if your leadership is just about now and about making you look good, you've missed the point of leadership. Leadership is to make a difference for future generations. I was staggered recently when I discovered the statistics that said 80% of businesses and churches and organizations die with their founder. 80%, because they didn't plan for future generations. It was about them, and when they went, they didn't have any other plans afterwards. And you know what? We're called to plan for the future. We're called to be diligent with what God has given us. And part of that is following Jesus' example of sowing into the future. And not just sowing into a few people that might follow us and take things on after us, but into future generations. It's about setting good principles. Curtis Cluett, who wrote the book 3G, talks about how you can have one generational leaders who just everything is about them. Two generational leaders who hand stuff on to the next generation but try and control them and try and manipulate them a little bit to make things their way. Or he talks about third generational leaders, thinking leaders. And what they do is they try and put good practices into all the people that follow them. And they try and teach them to teach others. And they try and make it multi-generational. So they don't have to control anything. It's not all about them. It's about the greater cause. And we are called to be 3-generational leaders, to focus on situations beyond ourselves, to focus on equipping the people who we lead to lead well, and to help others to lead well as well, and to make a difference for generations to come. Have you ever thought about it, that when Jesus ascended into heaven in Acts, there was 120 people left? A few days later, after Jesus had gone, there was 3,000. You know what? Jesus' impact wasn't just when he was on earth physically here. He sowed into people to make a difference for generations to come. Years later, there were billions who said they follow Jesus. In his lifetime, there was 120. You know, as leaders, we're there to build something and to equip and be part of something that will last for future generations and not just ourselves.